All right, good morning, everybody. So today we're getting into our proper AP US history materials. And to begin, we're going to take a look at the age of exploration, starting with what the world looked like before 1492. Then we'll start getting into the early colonization of the Americas. All right, so to begin, what do you think North America was like before Columbus in 1492? That should be a pretty easy question, taking a look at this map anyway. It was dominated, this side of the world, the North and South American continents, by a very diverse group of Native Americans. And hopefully, you guys are recognizing at least some of the names that we see here on this map. So you guys should be recognizing like the Cherokee, Powhatan. I would hope that you guys are recognizing stuff like Apache, Dakota, all right, Iroquois. These are all some of the more prominent ones in American history, plus a lot of other smaller ones that maybe you're not recognizing. So that just shows you how diverse all these groups were. They are all different. They all had, there were a lot of different languages, a lot of different practices, very diverse ways of living. So, like, for example, in the east, so like east of the Blue Ridge Appalachian Mountains, the Eastland Indians, they are groups like the Iroquois, the Powhatan, Cherokee. They had farming communities. All right. So you would have the crops like corn, known as maize to the natives. There, of course, would be hunting and fishing as well, but they were doing their own forms of agriculture. In the Central Plains, you have groups like the Sioux and the Cheyenne. They were the ones who were hunting the buffalo, but they would use something called mass hunting techniques. And this is arguably a brutal way to do hunting, but it worked for them. And what they would do is they would basically drive buffalo herds, or at least pieces of buffalo herds, off of cliffs where the fall would typically kill them or at least severely wound them. And the natives would go in and finish them off by, killing them. And then they would skin them, they would harvest the meat, they would basically dry it into jerky to preserve it. And the pelts they would use for making clothing and other garments, and they would also use it for making housing structures. So think of like the stereotypical Native American teepee, or the portable structures like that. And down south in where is modern day Mexico, we would have groups such as the Aztecs who would build these giant empires and dominate the surrounding areas through servitude and forced alliances, even. Right, so and there would be like the great capital city, Tenochtitlan, where there would be tens of thousands of people living there, bigger than any city there was in Europe at the time. All right. So then we're going to fast forward into the late 1400s during the Renaissance period. Hopefully you guys remember the Renaissance. It was a big time of rebirth in culture and interest in the world in Europe. And this would lead to the Europeans seeking out new options for trade, because the old trade routes like the Silk Road you see there on the map going from Asia to Europe was basically cut off a lot of the access to those trade routes because of the Ottoman Empire that was settling in the Middle East. They controlled this area here, modern day Turkey, which was basically at the crossroads between Asia and Europe. They didn't like a lot of trade with the Europeans because they're Christians and the Ottomans are Muslim. So the Europeans had to find alternate routes. So they started sending out ships using new technologies like bigger, stronger boats, as well as compasses and astrolabes for calculating where they were. And that is how we get all of these new discoveries and the expansion of European and Western culture and ideas going to the rest of the world. This is the beginning of all of that. All right. And by doing all this exploration, we're going to see overseas colonies being founded, which is going to then grow into overseas empires in some countries' cases. All right. And of course, you introduce new groups to each other, there's going to be a forever transformation of the two different groups. Native Americans, North or South, they will never be the same, and Europeans will never be the same after these first encounters. Right. A big part of it is this right here, the Columbian Exchange. When we get new food products, whether it's animal or plant life, going from one side to the other, from the New World to the Old World and the Old World to the New, you see a lot of change. All right. So like from the New World, some examples. We have things like peanuts, the potato, cacao bean, so like chocolate. And we have tobacco, things like that are all going to Europe. All things that are going to become like very important to Europeans. And coming to the New World, we've got things like sugarcane, bananas, we've got onions, citrus fruits, peaches, things that start to become known in the US. Like we have, Georgia's famous for their peaches. Bananas are grown in Florida. Sugarcane becomes a very big like cash crop in the Caribbean and in Brazil. Livestock, we get, cattle becomes very, very big and in some ways controversial to North America because we see declines in buffalo populations and rises in cattle populations. But perhaps one of the biggest things is when disease is brought in. If I'm not mistaken, only about one or two diseases went from the Americas to the Old World, and I know one of them was syphilis. But the natives of the Americas, they definitely got the short end of the stick by getting things like typhus, flu, smallpox, measles, malaria, all horrible, horrible diseases that would devastate the population. All right. Eventually killing about 90% of the native population of the Americas overall. Some places like islands in the Caribbean would see 98% death rates. Other places, not so high, but still significant numbers of deaths. So, like this example here, the beginning of European interest in Mexico, there's about 25 million people in Mexico that are natives. And, just under 100 years later, like 86 years later, roughly, they're down to 1 million. That's with, generations coming in, new generations of children being born, and the numbers are just dwindling down like that. All right. So Spain, since we're talking about Mexico, they sent out people called conquistadors to find gold and conquer land. And I would hope that you guys would at least know the names of one or two of these people, meaning Cortez and Pizarro. Especially if you'd had World 2 with me, I definitely talked about these two guys. All right, so Cortez, he's the guy who conquered the Aztecs and basically got Mexico under Spanish control, sent back tons of silver to Spain. And then we have Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Inca of Western South America in the Andes Mountains. He would send back tons of gold to Spain. Enough gold and silver went to Spain that they wound up crashing the economy because there was just too much money. All right. This right here, I'll tell you, that's how many millions of pesos, so like Spanish dollars, there was getting shipped from the Americas to Spain. Just tens of millions. And I will say this for anybody who's interested. Um, some of these treasure ships that were, loaded up with gold, there were those that sank. So there is actually still sunken Spanish gold, like in the Caribbean and in part, maybe some in the Atlantic. But yeah, if you ever want to go treasure exploring and treasure hunting, I should say, the Caribbean's not a bad place to give it a shot. All right. And because of the success of the Spanish, other countries are going to want to try and get involved in North America, such as the French, the English, the Dutch, some Swedish influence. But they would mostly go like a very, very small population that would be a part of like the middle colonies, like where the Dutch settled. All right. Let's see. So let's use a document here to see what Spanish colonies in North America were like. I find it confounding to attempt to Christianize the native peoples and then, when we have done so, to make slaves of them on our estates. In God's name, is that any way to treat Christians? Bartolome de las Casas. All right. So I guess based on this one, what do you see happening here? What you should be thinking is, all right, they're putting a lot of effort to Christianize natives. And under like Christianity, like at least the practices of the time, Christians did not own or like other Christians. If there were anybody who was going to be enslaved, it would be a quote unquote a heretic or a blasphemer, someone who was against the church, not a part of the church. Okay? So this guy right here, he was a Spanish missionary in the New World, and he was actually one of the first guys to speak out against the practices of like slavery in the Americas and like for the rights of native peoples. All right, this one. What can you tell me by looking at this chart, looking at, we're looking at stuff dealing with populations and different groups. So what might we see? If you're thinking that there is a social class system under the Spanish, you would be guessing correctly. All right. So Spain in the 16 and 1700s dominates Central and Southern America. Right? Why are they colonizing there? Think to yourself real quick. They want gold and silver, so they're just searching all over the place for it. They found a lot, a big time amount. Now, one of these side things is they were working to spread Catholicism, the Catholic Church of Christianity, and so they would establish a lot of missions or small church communities to help spread the word of Jesus and to convert natives to Christianity. All these red dots are different places where they set up missions to convert natives to Christianity. The yellow ones would be like where the French got involved. Now, the King of Spain did not want the people of these colonies ruling themselves, so he would appoint viceroys to govern over the colonies and rule them very, very strictly. There were no freedoms. They were basically like dictatorships that answered to the King of Spain. That's the best way that I can tell you to look at it. Right? So colonies, their economy is based on how much gold and silver they could provide to Spain. Right? The plantations or haciendas, they used the Indian workers for farming the cash crops like sugar, That was one of the big cash crops that the Spanish would be involved with. All right, let's look at this just a little bit more, the societal breakdown. So, the viceroys, people from Spain, they were at the top. They are the peninsulares. All right, white colonists who are descended from people from Spain. They're 100% Spanish, but they were born in the Americas. They are the Creoles. They had a lot of power. They were their own type of ruling class, but they only answered to the peninsulares, people from the peninsula of Spain. Then we get the mestizos. This is a group that is descended from Spanish men and native women, because there was a lot of lack of Spanish women in the colonies, especially early on. So this is the upper level of the mixed people. Okay. Then there was the mulattoes, which was the group that is half Spanish and half African. And then, of course, there would be the Native Americans and the enslaved Africans who would be at the bottom of the colonial society, because they were the ones who were enslaved and working all the plantations, making all the money for everybody else. All right, looking at this, what can you tell me about what's trying to be attempted, like with the French colonies in North America? Make sure you're paying close attention to the details here. Now, you should be noticing that there are both Native Americans and white people in this picture who are worshiping with the Catholic priest here. So what might that tell you if we're seeing both racial groups here at the same time doing the same exact thing? Hopefully it's telling you that they at least didn't mind being around each other. Maybe there's better cooperation going on. If that's what you're thinking, you would be correct. All right, how about here? This is still dealing with the French. Obviously, there's trade going on. I hope you guys can tell what that is that's being handed off. That would be a fur or an animal pelt. The French were very big in the fur trade during the early colonial period. So, French explorer in the 1600s, Samuel de Champlain, he would fail to find the Northwest Passage. That is a sea route going over top of North America into the Pacific. But he would find his way to establishing the colony of Quebec, like the modern day city of Quebec. So France is then going to claim land that goes from Canada all the way down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. So looking at that map in North America, right up here, this big green area, that is all the French territory. All right. Who wants to take a guess at why the French wanted to colonize America? All right. Let's take a look and see if what you're thinking might be correct. All right. Like Spain, they were looking for wealth, and they wanted to convert people to Catholicism. So if you remember those documents, the pictures of the people worshiping and the trade, that should be your answer. Okay? Now, the French were very interested in the fur trade, like I was saying before, and that was their biggest moneymaker. But they did participate in small-scale farming, so basically, the colonies were self-sufficient when it came to food production. They would also provide a lot of lumber. Europe, they had basically chopped down a lot of their forests. They were trying to conserve the trees that they had left. So they had to go to other sources for lumber for building and like ships and homes and, making things. So the North American continent was an untapped resource because there were just trees as far as the eyes could see everywhere you went. So that was a actually a decent trade commodity as well. But the fur trade was where most of the money was. And because the French wanted the furs, they actually had a really good trading relationship with Native Americans that they interacted with. And it was basically a business deal. They weren't here to settle and just build up populations and build cities and make an empire in that way. They were more interested in the business aspect. All right. And for a French person to even come to North America, they had to be Catholic. No French Protestants were allowed to go to French colonies in the Americas. You had to be Catholic. Right. And similar to the Spanish, the French had a strict control over their colonies. They had royal governors, just like the Peninsulares, the viceroys, who basically ruled it like a little dictatorship. And, you know, they knew everything that everybody was up to. There wasn't a whole lot of sneaking around going on. All right. Next, let's take a look at the Dutch. So take a look at this picture. What do you think the Dutch are going to be involved with? All right, if you remember that map from earlier, they were going to like the middle area. If you're thinking maybe around like the New Jersey, New York part of the East Coast, you would be thinking correctly. This picture right here is basically like the trade ships, and you could make the argument that this is New York, because Dutch are actually going to be the first people to settle in what is modern day New York City. All right. And what might you see going on here? Well, if you're seeing Native Americans signing a paper and being presented with like beads, like trinkets, that would be correct. That plays into their story of the interaction of the Dutch and the Native Americans of the New York area. All right. The Dutch created the present day city of New York, but when they did it, it was called New Amsterdam, because Amsterdam's the capital of the Netherlands. And their overall colony was called New Netherland, but the top spot in it was New Amsterdam. But why did the Dutch colonize? Let's take a look. They were hoping to profit from trade in the Americas. They wanted to be like the big shipping company, moving the goods of the British, the French, the Spanish. They wanted to get involved with just shipping stuff around, getting their cut, essentially. All right. Now, the Dutch people didn't really want to go and settle in North America, so the Dutch government actually went out to other countries looking for people who wanted to go to the New World to try and, stake their claim and make their fortune in the New World, a place where, somebody could start a business and it didn't matter what their background was and they could be successful. There were more political freedoms in exchange for people who wanted to go. So they had more say in the community. There wasn't some viceroy or governor who was like a dictator. They had a say in what happened with their lives and their businesses. So, as you can imagine, this would be one of the most diverse places, and it still is one of the most diverse places on the East Coast. Right. We're going to get just a little bit with the British, and next time we'll actually be looking even a deeper look at the British colonies and them getting started. But anyway, judging by this, what you think it might be like, for any of you who know what that plant is, tobacco. And that's going to be a very profitable crop for the British colonies, especially in the South. All right. And what about this? If you're thinking that it's religion-based, you'd be thinking correctly. So we're getting a little bit of both here. We're getting religious aspect and we're getting trade aspect. So like the Dutch, the British settled in America through different companies of private investors. It wasn't really government sponsored like the Spanish and the French were. This was private companies. So they ran it like a company. All right, so when you're talking about the British colonists, we're getting a lot of various groups. Some people came to escape poverty, to get their hands on some money and some land because they couldn't back in Britain. Some came for religious freedom, such as the Puritans, the Pilgrims who went up into the New England area, like modern day Massachusetts. And some, they would go just for the business aspect. That would be like the middle colonies, like New York, all the way down to Georgia. All right. So the colonies are going to be very different from each other depending on where you were. So since it's basically run like a business, the government is going to use a policy that's basically called salutary neglect. So basically, the colonies could create their own laws, their own taxes. They could govern themselves how they saw fit. And the British would be like, hey, as long as we still get our money, we don't care what you do. So it's going to be like that all the way until the 1750s and 60s. And that's going to start a whole new slew of issues that we will get into at a later time. But royal governors were still there, but they were basically the go-to person between the government in Britain and the colonies. They had some say over issues, but for the most part, the assemblies and councils and leading bodies that were elected, they did most of the work politically in the colonies. All right, societies and economies of the colonies of the British were very dependent on the people. It's like the southern colonies. They had a lot to do with the cash crops. That was the biggest part of their economy. So you would start to see like these very, very wealthy landowners, and then you would see the poor people who are, farming their own land and basically providing for themselves and maybe a little bit to sell. You would see a lot of slave labor over the course of the slave trade when slaves were allowed to be brought into the Americas, into North America. Let's just go with that one. Roughly, of the many millions of Africans who were brought over to the Americas, about 500,000 to 750,000 were brought to the 13 British colonies. All right, it's a smaller percentage of the whole group, because most of them went to the Caribbean and to South America, but 500,000 to 750,000 did come to the 13 colonies. All right, in New England, places like Massachusetts and New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, this was more based on religion, these colonies. Religious freedom, they were more self-sufficient when it came to farming, not a lot of great farmland up there. So they provided enough for themselves, but they became actually very good at building ships. All right. So they would get involved with trade and building ships. Then we have a little bit of this going on. Unlike Spain and France, the British colonists never tried to convert the native people to Christianity. They didn't want to do a lot of intermarrying or do a lot of trade. So it was very much, you stay over there, we'll stay over here, and it would often come to conflict, and there would be a series of early wars between natives and the settlers all along the frontier. The further they expanded outward to the west, the more conflicts that came between these two groups. All right. So that's where we're going to leave off today. And next time, we are going to take an even deeper look at the British colonies, getting into stuff like Jamestown. We'll talk a little bit about Roanoke. We'll get into all of that. All right. Have a good one. See you next time.